Hello, everyone. Thank you, Justina. It is such a great pleasure to welcome you all to King's tonight for this special occasion, which is the inaugural lecture of Katherine Schofield, Professor of South Asian Music and History and currently head of the Department of Music here. Inaugural lectures are really important moments, both in the life of a scholar and in the life of a university. They give us a chance not only to celebrate individual achievement, but also to reflect on the intellectual journeys that shape our disciplines and our shared sense of purpose as scholars and students. They also enable us to celebrate academic success with our friends and family in ways that aren't normally possible as an academic. And I particularly welcome Katherine's family and friends here tonight. Katherine's journey is in every sense a brilliant one. She began as a musician, training as a classical viola player in the Queensland Conservatorium of Music. And that grounding in performance seems to me to shape her work in profound ways, both in the attentiveness to which she approaches sound, but also in the subtlety to which she seems to listen to texts, to images, and to the faint traces of past experience. From those beginnings in Queensland as a musician and through her doctoral work at SOAS in South Asian music history, she's become one of the most original and influential voices in the cultural history of early modern South Asia. Since joining King's in 2009, she's helped to shape the Department of Music in enduring ways, as a researcher, as a teacher, and as a leader. Her work exemplifies an intellectual openness that moves across the boundaries of disciplines, bringing together musicology, history, art history, and literary studies, and drawing on a really exceptional range of languages and of archival materials. Her recent award-winning 2023 book, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India, is a landmark in this respect and a wonderful example of the richness and the ambition of her scholarship. Drawing on a vast and previously little studied archive of Indian writings alongside visual sources, the book offers the first full history of music and musicians in late Mughal India between roughly 1748 and 1858. It takes the lives of 9 musicians as its starting point, using them as entry points into 6 different kinds of music, to 6 different kinds of writing on music. And it moves across cultural centres from Delhi to Lucknow, Hyderabad and Jaipur, as well as into British colonial contexts. What comes out of that book, I think, is not just a history of music, but a deeply textured account of how a major cultural field responded to the upheavals of political and economic change as Mughal power gave way to British rule. The book shows how and through whom Hindustani music came to take on its modern classical form during this crucial transitional century. And it, I think, opens up for us an extraordinary range of voices, listeners and performers and writers, whose stories help us to understand what music meant in lived experience. Running through the book is a big question about ephemerality, whether it's ever really possible to recapture the experience of music once the performance itself has vanished. Katherine's answer is, it seems to me, to not so much to resolve that question as to explore it, showing how historical texts and stories and images enable us to come closer to lost moments than we might have thought possible. It's a work of enormous distinction, and fittingly, she's the first person to have been awarded 2 major scholarly prizes for this single book, the Otto Kelde Award of the American Musicological Society and the Ananda Kentish Coomaraswamy Prize for the Association for Asian Studies. On a more personal note, although I'm only relatively recently arrived at King's, it's striking how quickly one becomes aware of Katherine's distinctive qualities as a colleague and as a leader. She brings, I think, a wonderfully clear and thoughtful directness to conversations that gets to the heart of the matter whilst remaining open, constructive, and generously engaged. That clarity is there in her scholarship. She's got an instinct for what really matters in an argument and the confidence to pursue it with both rigor and imagination. At the same time, I know that she is deeply attentive to the ideas and the contributions of others, and it's clear how supportive and energizing that combination is for colleagues and for students alike. Even as a relatively new arrival, one quickly sees how valued she is, not only for her intellectual leadership, but also for the spirit in which she offers it. Her influence, of course, extends well beyond her own work. She supervised a large and remarkable group of doctoral students, many of whom are now shaping the field in their own right. She's contributed to building a department, and now leading it, that is both intellectually ambitious and genuinely collegial. And as the first woman to serve as the head of the Department of Music at King's, she's brought a distinctive and generous style of leadership to that role. In her wider work as co-chair of the university's Heads of Department Forum, she's also been a thoughtful and committed advocate for colleagues across the institution. What is perhaps the most distinctive about Katherine's work and the way she shares it is that it encourages us to listen differently, to attend not only to words and objects, but to sound, to feeling, and to forms of experience that are often difficult to capture. It reminds us that the past is not simply something we read about. It is something we can, with care and imagination, learn to hear again. This evening's lecture offers us an opportunity to experience that approach for ourselves. It promises not only to open up a fascinating cultural world, but also to show us something about how scholarship can expand the ways in which we think and understand. So please join me in welcoming Professor Katherine Schofield, who is going to deliver her inaugural lecture on If There Is a Heaven on Earth, Life, Death, and the Spaces Between in South Asian Music.
Thank you, Abby, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. If I can ask you to make sure that my phone is off, that would be a good thing. All right. Just unwrapping the parcel. So it is absolutely lovely to see so many people from the many phases of my life and work here this evening, from my parents who have known me all my life, to my family, beloved mentors, friends and students, to people I don't yet know who must be here for the free drinks. Every one of you is welcome. But tonight I especially wish to remember absent friends and comrades. All those who have entered our work and lives and loves profoundly and who have gone forever. Tonight's talk on music as a great raging against the dying of the light is for them, those of my colleague friends who died too young, for Aditya Behel, who died in 2009, for Alison Bush, 2019, Bruce Winnell, 2020, Kavita Singh, 2023, and my dear friend Michael Bywater, who died last August. And in this vein, I would like also to briefly remember the noted music theorist Arnold Whittle, long-standing member of the music department, who passed away this week. Older members of the audience will remember him fondly, and I offer our condolences on behalf of the music department. Michael was a tremendous musician and a beautiful writer, and our correspondence and conversations over the years haunt all of my work. In his 2002 book, Lost Worlds, he wrote this poignant reflection on the Roman Emperor Hadrian's love song to his own little soul, as he feared for its loneliness when he died and they were separated. Animula uagula blandula, hospes comesque corporis, quae nunc abibis in loca, pallidula, rigida, nudula, nec ut soles dabis iocos, which translates roughly as lovely wandering little soul, guest of the body and dearest friend. Where will you go when you leave me? Will you be pale and cold and lonely? Will you still tell jokes as you used to? This is Michael's reflection. When great worlds fall, we marvel and reach for our pens. When tiny worlds fall, we are silenced. We live our lives under the shadows of lost love, when reconciliations fail or lie unsought, and each one is a small society, sometimes just of two, with its own language and history, its stories and memories that cannot survive on their own in the dark. And worst of all, the jokes. Where did they go when everything else has gone? I have an answer for you now, Michael. They remain here, within us who remain in the barzakh of memory. More on the concept of the barzakh as we go on. Why honor all these people, you, the living and the dead, at the head of my talk? This will become relevant, I promise. Because in philosopher Charles Taylor's terms, the self is not buffered, but porous. Because all of you shaped me and everything that I think and do, and I you. And because you will therefore, in ways manifest and unmanifest, be present in what I say this evening. As I tell my students, scholarship is not a solo improvisation. It is a polyphony into which our own voice only ever enters part way through. Our job is first to listen to the voices already in the mix before adding our own voice, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes clashing contrapuntally, then resolving, but always in attentive conversation. As we go on, new voices will enter and blend with ours, and at some point, our own voice will end and pass into silence, and the polyphony will go on without us, but forever changed because we were once part of it. Crucially, I'm not just talking here about the standard academic practice of reading and responding to other people's writing. That bit's obvious. Our most profound shaping as scholars and humans, our greatest epiphanies, our deepest learning to sing in harmony is done in person, communally, with others, in rooms like this one, listening and responding to speakers. Better still, in the coffee breaks and corridors and receptions afterwards. In more intensive one-to-one mentoring and small group meetings and classroom teaching, but also, and most importantly, through long-range, deep sociality built around repeated, enjoyable sensory and emotional experiences, stimulating conversations around tables in cafes and restaurants and pubs, on long walks and at concerts and visiting museums together. That our best ideas are created in the bodily presence of like-minded creatures is because humans are not mere brains in a jar. As recent anthropologists and historians of the emotions and senses have underlined, we are not just minds, we are bodies, and we have emotions, and all three are completely inseparable in our experience and understanding of the world. Descartes be damned. What is more, scholars of emotions from a range of scientific and humanities disciplines have recently come to a consensus. In historian Margaret Pernod's words, emotions are no longer conceived as existing inside neatly delineated and bounded subjects, selves, but in the in-between. Emotions and thoughts, for that matter, are not individual, they are relational. They arise between us collectively, not inside us individually. We experience and feel and come to know the world together because we are porous selves, not buffered selves. We need to spend a quick moment with Charles Taylor's concept of porous and buffered selves because it's a crucial girder in my unfolding argument. The hardcore moderns in the audience, especially the men, are going to hate this idea. But the concept of an individual, boundaried, self-autonomous from other selves is modern. It has a history and it's recent, no earlier than the 18th century. Margaret Pernod paraphrases Taylor's concepts thus. The porous self, which he identifies with the enchanted world of the pre-modern, can be permeated by the outside world, by spirits, by the emotions and the thoughts of other people, whereas the buffered self, a phenomenon belonging to the secular age, has stable boundaries and thus controls what can enter it. The core of self is no longer situated in a relational in-between, but on the inside. It has a core that is independent of relations and exists before them. Don't worry, we don't have to return to belief in supernatural entities to accept recent findings that modern selves, in fact, remain porous, permeable to, and in part constituted of sensations, emotions, and thoughts coming from other selves and other things in the world. Just look at how nutty primary school children get when it's very windy. What is key to note this evening is that the elite early modern Mughal men of North India, who have long been the subject of my research, likewise viewed the self as porous and relational. Purno again, drawing on Aristotelian concepts, the Indo-Persianate ethical or akhlaq literature on which the Mughals based their worldview depicts the ideal virtuous self as needing to keep the emotions in a state of balance. This emotion management, however, can never be limited to the individual's own feelings, but extends to the feelings that a person encounters, as emotions do not belong to one individual, but float between multiple ones. The self is its relations. Moreover, virtue could not be considered a virtue at all unless and until it was manifested socially in the world with others. That Mughal men perceived the self to be porous and emotions and virtues to arise relationally between selves changes how we understand their answer to tonight's fundamental question. What is music for? For the Mughals had a very clear answer to this question. Music was powerful beyond reason, they would have said supernaturally, and music existed to move the emotions. As major Mughal music theorist Fakhrullah put it in 1666, both music's essence, what music is, and its resultant effect, what music is for, was to arouse tender sympathy in the heart, qalb. In Islamic philosophy, the meeting place of the ethical and intellectual, the divine and the human, the eternal and temporal, the spiritual and the physical. In other words, another barzakh. We'll get there. According to Mughal Emperor Akbar's great ideologue Abul Fazl, writing in 1593, this is how it worked. The magical power of music causes the beautiful creatures of the harem of the heart to shine forth on the tongue. The melodies then enter through the window of the ear and return to their former seat, the heart, bringing with them thousands of presents. The hearers, according to their insight, are moved to sorrow or to joy. If the listener's qalb, their heart, mind, intellect, were open to outside sensory and emotional influences and to other qulub in this way, if musically induced emotions were not interior and individual, but emerged collectively between musicians and listeners in the moment of performance, as the hegemonic Sanskritic aesthetic theory of 9 affective essences known as rasas also taught, then how did music do this? How does music generate collective emotions and experiences? In what follows, I'm going to suggest that the answer lies in musicians' ability in live performance, particularly of improvised music, to create, largely through sonic, not textual means, a liminal space-time that alters listeners' perceptions of the ordinary flow of time. I'm going to draw on my decades of work on Persian and Urdu texts as a historian of elite music in Mughal and early colonial India and connect my earlier theorization of the liminality of musicians and of the Mughal majlis, or musical assembly, to the cognate Sufi concept of the barzakh, the isthmus between two worlds, which I think is on operation when the Persian and Urdu ghazal is sung in the majlis in rag and tal, the North Indian classical melodic and rhythmic systems that are supposed to create the rasas in the space in between participants. And I'm going to note in passing, because this is brand new for me, the affinities between my findings and the work of Patrick Eisenlaw and Birgit Abels on sonic atmospheres, spatially extended emotions. Because I'm beginning to think that the primary emotional aesthetic I've long identified at work in the Mughal Majlis, the poignancy of transience, the exquisite fleeting savoring of life in the face of mortality, may be an atmosphere rather than an aesthetic or an emotion. A final brief word then on atmospheres. According to anthropologist Patrick Eisenlaw, based on his work with Muslim listeners to Urdu devotional poetry in Mauritius called Naat, atmospheres are spatially extended emotions that rely on the notion of the porous and relational self, and extend emotions into physical spaces inhabited by people gathered for an occasion. Atmospheres are distinct entities created by half things, phenomena that are fleeting and can be interrupted, such as wind, heat and cold, the weather, pain, and critically, a voice or musical figures. Atmospheres suffuse settings and situations with sensations and take hold of the bodies of human actors emplaced in such environments. Sonic atmospheres are created, obviously, by the sensation of sound or music on assembled bodies at bounded sonic events, including those such as this one, and are both immediately impactful and diffusely meaningful, and given further qualified meanings through culturally specific discourses about sound or music. The concept of sonic atmospheres resolves a dispute between scholars of sound who argue either that sound itself inherently pre-culturally possesses the power to affect bodies, or that cultural practices centered on the self and the body invest sound with power that it doesn't inherently have, by demonstrating, exactly as the Mughals believed, that it's both. When you're at a live musical performance or a sonic event, you can catch the emotions in the room, feel the vibe, even if you have no idea what's going on in the music. And at the same time, people in the same room who've grown up listening to such events within communities of belonging will be interpreting those emotions through bodies that have been culturally attuned through repeated experience, mediated by ideas that explain in culturally appropriate terms what those emotions mean and are supposed to feel like. In particular, sound is patterned, and the sense of motion that transmits to bodies affects how it's felt emotionally and understood culturally. Particularly important tonight is that Eisenlaw's Muslim interlocutors believe that the sonic suggestions of motion inherent in an effective performance of Urdu devotional poetry in the majlis can bring about the spiritual presence of the Prophet among his devotees even long after his death. Furthermore, historian of North Indian Muslims Margaret Purno uses the concept of the porous self and its susceptibility to atmospheres to argue for a porous present that is distinguished from the past, but whose boundaries remain permeable. The past may exist on a different plane than the present, but it is not gone and remains linked to the present. The example she uses? The interaction of South Asian Muslims, both Mughal and today, with Sufi saints who, though dead, still retain the possibility of communicating with their disciples from within their graves, and whose presence is particularly powerfully felt in the majlis-i samā, the spiritual musical assembly at the tomb shrine of the saint. Again, we don't have to believe in saints to perceive the porousness of the present to the past. Where do the jokes go when everything else has gone? They remain here with me, Michael. Let's start with the liminality of Mughal musicians and the liminal space-time of the courtly Mughal majlis, the gathering of intimate male friends for experiencing music and live poetry. Then turn to the nature of the ghazals sung in that space as a barzakh that creates the paradise garden through sound, and finally consider how musicians manipulate the sonic structures of the sung ghazal to make the worlds of the living and the dead momentarily co-present. My main interest, in fact, is in the secular courtly majlis and its grief for the definitive loss in this world of the human beloved. But cultural interpretations of the Sufi majlis, in which the beloved lives forever on a different plane, heavily inflected the courtly majlis's sonic atmosphere. And as all aficionados of Urdu poetry know, the lines between these worlds are blurry. The Mughals were a Muslim dynasty hailing originally from Central Asia who ruled over India from a historical peak of its wealth and geopolitical power in the 16th and 17th centuries, ostensibly until 1858. The Mughals and their courtiers and vassals, notably the Hindu Rajputs, used the Persian language as a lingua franca and language of high culture. But they also cultivated two high registers of North Indian vernaculars, Braj or classical Hindi, and Rehta, later known as Urdu, as the languages of poetry and song. The musicians they patronized most enthusiastically were hereditary professional performers of Hindustani music, both men from the Kalawant, Qawwal, and Dhari communities, and women from the highest status courtesan castes. Hindustani or North Indian classical music comprised a repertoire of virtuosic instrumental forms and song genres in Persian and Indian languages, most popularly in later centuries, the ghazal, which was a discovery of my book, that used the North Indian melodic and rhythmic systems known as rag and tal as the basis of short fixed compositions and extended live improvisations. The Mughals and Rajputs listened to these musicians in intimate same-sex gatherings of elite friends dedicated to the connoisseurship, the tasting of the arts of pleasure, called the majlis, or in modern terms, the mehfil. And it's the particular atmosphere of the majlis in which I am interested. Both the musicians who entered the majlis and the majlis itself were liminal. In work I published 20 years ago, based on my reading of the relationships between Mughal musicians and their patrons against the work of anthropologist Victor Turner, I argued that professional musicians in most societies possess occupational liminal status. That is to say, an active ability when performing to cross social boundaries that members of their social class ordinarily cannot. Musicians in South Asia, as servants performing cultural labor, were historically of low social status and, as hereditary professionals, low caste, outsiders to what Mughal theorist Mirza Khan called the Zat-e Sharif, the respectable classes. But the cultural capital that accrued to the product of their labor, their music, enabled, indeed required them to cross into the highest status spaces of the royal courts and intimate elite assemblies, to mingle in close proximity with high status patrons, and critically, in the moment of musical performance, to exercise power over them. That was their job, these low status people, to move the assembly's emotions. But much more than that, music was believed to have supernatural power to balance or unbalance the humours of the human body, the body politic, and even the natural world, to cause rain to fall, to tame snakes, to conjure jinns and spirits, and to bring into presence the saintly dead from the barzakh of the grave. Courtesans, of course, were doubly liminal because in a sharply gender-segregated world, they did not marry nor enter secluded women's spaces, but dwelt entirely within male space with the highest respect as something both more and less than ordinary women. The extraordinariness of their liminality is particularly revealed in their roles as ritually auspicious performers in the Rajput courts, where when they performed in festivals associated with the Hindu ritual year, they were believed to actually become avatars of the deity. And this painting, attributed to Sahib Ram from the court of Jaipur around 1800, according to Molly Aitken, depicts a female courtesan caught in the very process of becoming the male god Krishna during a performance of Ras Leela. The extraordinary power wielded by these low status people through music was thus a clear and present danger to high status men. But at the same time, musical listening was essential to elite men's well-being. In other published work, I've shown that the Mughals solved this conundrum by carefully controlling the musical and social etiquette of the majlis, so that it became a curated liminal space-time for the exploration of pleasure and the imagination, deliberately set apart from the ordinary time of work and duty, in which the cherished emotions of Indo-Persianate high culture, passionate love, ishq or shringar, and the grief of separation from the beloved firaq, viraha, could safely be performed. The catharsis necessary for dispelling worldly cares and restoring humoral balance securely achieved, and the threat posed by musicians satisfactorily diffused. After the last note was sounded, the musicians packed up their instruments, crossed back over the border into real life, and went home. Let's look now at the specific quality of the sensations and emotions engendered by Hindustani musicians in the liminal space-time of the majlis by focusing on what they sang. Of all the genres sung in this space, the ghazal is the most helpful to us because it was frequently self-referential. As we'll see, I think the aim of the majlis was to create a heightened, in-the-moment experience of dwelling with the beloved in the paradise garden of the imagination that never dies. As Amir Khusro put it, Agar Firdos baruya zamin ast, hamin ast, o hamin ast, o hamin ast. If there is a heaven on earth, it is here, it is here, it is here, while all the while knowing that the beloved will, in fact, die, thus underlining the listener's sense of transience and their own mortality, of living in the face of death. The ghazal is a short lyrical genre of Persian and Urdu poetry consisting of a tight set of rhyming couplets. To give you a basic sense of form, these are 2 couplets from a Persian ghazal by the medieval master Hafiz of Shiraz. This ghazal became absurdly famous as a courtly song performed by Indian courtesans across the late Mughal world, particularly in Lucknow. The late Kavita Singh argued that this curious but brilliantly executed painting by Mir Kalan Khan depicts the Indian courtesan on the right, singing the Persian beloveds on the left into being in the barzakh of her, and therefore our, imaginations. Given when and where it was painted, I'd like to think this gorgeous fantasy depicts a performance of this very ghazal. Each ghazal uses a single classical meter, in this case, long, short, short, long, short, long, short, long, long, short, short, long, short, long, short, long. Mut tribi khush nava bego, taza ba taza no ba no. In terms of rhyme, it deploys a simple A, B, A, C, A end rhyme scheme. Here, the end rhyme for the A lines is a whole phrase, taza ba taza no ba no, ever fresh and ever new. There's also an internal rhyme at the end of the half line. The content is standard fare for the ghazal, one of thousands of poems celebrating the sensual joys of wine, young men, and song. By convention and frequently in practice, both lover and beloved were male. The poem also describes all the things enjoyed in the real-life majlis, which took place in a secluded garden or, during inclement weather, in a pavilion or room decked out like a garden. It's also self-referential, for ghazals, including this very one, were themselves recited and sung in the majlis. We can see in the painting a poet on the right waiting to recite his verse. But Hafez ghazal can also be read metaphorically for its deeper Sufi resonances, in which each element of the poem can stand in for the other elements and for profound mystical ideas, layering up experiential homologies, thus deepening and intensifying all elements, creating a kind of interface or meeting place between worldly and spiritual in the suspended moment of live performance. The musician, the pourer of wine, the young beloved are all mirrors of God, the divine beloved. The sound of music, the taste of wine, the sight of the young man's beauty, the scent of the garden, the touch of the gentle breeze on the skin and the lover's kiss, delights for all 5 senses, all stand in for the indescribable 6th sense experience of spiritual delight in approaching the divine beloved, near enough to almost. The classic metaphor here is of the moth approaching the candle flame, the Sufi seeking annihilation in the burning, purifying flame of God's love. Rumi's famous line, "The result of love is naught but this, I burned and I burned and I burned." Which brings us back to Khusro. In the 13th century, it is here, it is here, it is here, because taza ba taza, describes an earthly space that can be enjoyed in and of itself, but that also stands in for another place entirely. Khusro's verse invokes the paradise garden, firdaus from the old Persian word paradesa, that the Mughals then related to real places on earth in India that came to stand in for the heavenly garden, and within which heaven could be sensed through the imagination. In the Quran, paradise is described as a garden that knows neither extreme heat or cold, beneath which 4 rivers flow, and in which the fortunate ones enjoy each other's company as they recline on couches under shady trees with hanging clusters of fruit, eating and drinking. In his book Mughal Arcadia, Sunil Sharma argues that the entire empire was poetically conceived as an earthly manifestation of the heavenly garden. Khusro is said to have written his verse about Kashmir, a favorite Mughal summer retreat. Sharma writes that the Kashmir Valley was thought to actually approximate the experience of paradise. The Emperor Jahangir celebrated Kashmir in verse as the actualization of Persian garden poetry, and this is Sharma's translation. The coquettes of the garden displayed themselves, cheeks adorned, each like a lamp. The melody of the dawn-rising nightingales sharpen the desire of wine drinkers. A carpet of flowers and greenery laid out in a garden, the lamp of the rose lit by the breeze. The violet has twisted the ends of her locks, tying a tight knot in the heart of the rosebud. Here, the human figures and man-made delights of the earthly majlis, musicians, lovers, flowery carpets, lamps, the beloved's curly locks, have become real flowers, birds, and green meadows. A real landscape, garden-like but natural, stands in for an imaginary majlis, and at the same time, an imagined heavenly garden. So here we have an earthly garden, a heavenly garden, and in between them, the garden of the imagination, which is neither material nor spiritual, but evoked through infinite chains of metaphor. Similarly, we have an earthly majlis of lovers exploring the 5 senses, a heavenly majlis where the spiritual delights evoked by the bodily senses will finally be tasted, and between them, the majlis of the imagination, evoked in poetry and painting and potently brought to life musically in the ghazals, sung live in the earthly majlis. In the majlis of the imagination, the worlds of sensory and spiritual delights meet, and it can be peopled as much by the blessed dead as the living. In Sufi philosophy, such an in-between or liminal space is known as a barzakh. In Niall Green's definition, a person or point of being in which the divine and human worlds join. Critically, when a Muslim dies, he or she does not go straight to paradise. Rather, the soul in the grave inhabits a barzakh, a liminal space-time between death and the day of resurrection or qiyamah. Barzakh means an isthmus that intervenes between or separates 2 things, an interface. And there are intersecting barzakhs throughout my talk, as you may have noticed. We've already had memory, the heart, the ghazal, the majlis, the garden, and now the grave. The word barzakh appears 3 times in the Quran, but the multiple connotations of the concept spiritually were worked out by the most widely influential of the Sufi philosophers, the medieval Andalusian Ibn Arabi. Barzakh is first used in the Quran to refer to the soul in the grave, which can see, hear, and is aware of its surroundings. And for the person of faith, the barzakh of the grave, like paradise after the day of judgment, is also experienced as an imagined garden. The 2 other Quranic references are to an isthmus between sweet and bitter oceans that keeps them from mixing, Bahrain. The 2 oceans are generally understood as the material and spiritual worlds, and the barzakh between them as the realm of the imagination, which is located in the heart. In the barzakh of the imagination, things take form as they do in the material world. You can see them and hear them in your mind's eye and ear, but as in the spiritual world, they do not have physical substance. The final main use of barzakh is to describe the insani kamil, the perfected human being. Such rare people, prophets and saints, are able to serve as intermediaries between the ordinary believer and the divine world. According to 18th century Indian Sufi Maja Khaja Mir Dard, The Prophet of Islam is able to be present in this world now to intercede for us despite having left this perishable world. Critically then, those who attain spiritual mastery may after death transcend normal boundaries of time and space and become accessible to ordinary believers through the barzakh of the imagination, through dreams, and through emplaced atmospheres brought on by the stimulation of the bodily senses and emotions. All of these barzakhs, the garden, the grave, the saints, the imagination, and the majlis, coincide in specific places on earth where the veil between heaven and earth, the dead, and the living momentarily becomes diaphanous in a highly charged way. To bring heaven to earth, the Mughals built gardens on the model of the Persian paradise garden or charbagh, divided into quadrants by 4 water channels representing the 4 rivers of paradise. Several were built along the river Yamuna running through the Mughal capital of Agra. These gardens became sites of many a courtly gathering where poetry was recited, music delighted in, friendships sealed, and wine drunk. But the most famous of the Mughal paradise gardens surrounds the Taj Mahal. The placement of the grave of Shah Jahan's beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, within a paradise garden could not create a more potent barzakh between the worlds of the living and the dead. But the Taj Mahal is not in the center of the 4 water channels of its garden, where you might expect it to be, but at one end, overlooking the river, and another charbagh on the opposite bank. The river Yamuna, holy to Hindus, thus becomes the major river running through paradise. But the Mughals also made paradise gardens out of stone. Shah Jahan designed his great fort of Shah Jahanabad in Delhi to be a stone tent city in a series of paradise gardens with open-sided pavilions that could be left open in the hot weather to let breezes waft over cooling fountains and through marble halls. Or in cold weather, closed in with heavy hangings and flowers covered in silk and woolen carpets decorated with tiny woven flowers. The walls, too, were covered in stone flowers, inlaid semi-precious jewels, and raised up in carvings. And above the doorway into the hall of private audience, Shah Jahan inlaid the first line of Khusro's verse, "If there is a heaven on earth," inviting us to complete it in our imaginations. It is here, it is here, it is here in this imaginary garden made of stone. And it was here in the hall of private audience that the emperor held his own musical majlis. And ultimately, it was through the collective sensual, emotional, and imaginative experience of the musical assembly gathered to listen to the ghazal and other genres, with the majlis's intense saturation in all 5 earthly senses, opening up the intermediary realm of the imagination, that Mughal gentlemen were able to inhabit and enjoy the imaginary paradise garden. For it was primarily hearing music and feeling it in the body that created the essential sense of suspended temporality for the gathering's participants, set apart from the everyday flow of time, that turned the majlis into the paradise garden for the assembled company. Take these 2 couplets from an Urdu ghazal by late Mughal poet Ghalib. At night, in the moment of the gathering, we imagined that every corner of the carpet was so abundant with flowers that it might be the apron of a gardener or the fist of a flower seller. The gracefulness of the cupbearer's walk and the pleasure of the sound of the harp made this a heaven, Jannat, for the eye, that a paradise, Firdos, for the ear. The experience of music itself is an imagined paradise garden. I'm now going to show you how, and this is the roughest bit of the talk, how musicians manipulate the sonic structures of the song ghazal to create the imagined paradise garden in which the worlds of the living and the dead are momentarily co-present. You'll have to use your own imaginations a little here, as I have to rely on the porosity of the past to the present to make my argument. My auditory examples are perforce drawn from modern mediated classical and Sufi performances. My example is 2 versions of an 18th century Urdu ghazal by Siraj Aurangabadi, Hear News of Love's Bewilderment. I've chosen it in part because Siraj often wrote ghazals deliberately with a dual purpose, to be sung by courtly performers and by the qawwals, the hereditary Sufi musicians attached to the tomb shrines or dargahs of Sufi saints. The Chishti order of Sufis, dominant in India and Pakistan, has long embraced the use of music as a means of entering heightened emotional states that create a temporary barzakh in which earthly devotees interface with the spiritual world through hal or vajd. I will look briefly at the sung form of the classical ghazal before moving on to examine how music facilitates the thinning of the veil between worlds in the Sufi devotional assembly, especially at the spatial conjunction of multiple barzakhs that constitutes the Sufi shrine. At the end, I'll return to how, drawing from the same sonic resources, the relationship between life and death was experienced quite differently in the Mughal courtly majlis. The sang ghazal is an exceptionally versatile genre that's made its way into a number of settings with quite different social functions. The courtly majlis, in which the focus is on beautiful execution and the lyrics' more worldly meanings. The Sufi majlis-i samā, where it's sung by qawwals to bring listeners into a state of ecstasy called hal or vajd. And in the last century, the filmy love song. The ghazal's basic musical structure is simple, enabling its versatility. When sung, the A lines of the ghazal are always sung to the same melody that acts as an anchor or returning chorus for the performance, while the B and C lines, etc., are sung to a contrasting melody. But within those minimal parameters, depending on the venue and the style, the lines can be pulled apart to allow any number of improvised lyrics or melodies to be inserted and single phrases and words of the ghazal to be repeated. This is because in all settings, the ghazal's singer's principal duty is to evoke the multiple shades of emotional meaning in the lyrics in order to increase the audience's enjoyment or intensity of experience. Listen to the unfolding of this courtly rendering by Shaukat Ali for Pakistan TV. I've highlighted the words hawa, jal gaya, and jisse dil because he draws them out using melodic and temporal expansion to emphasize the words wind, scorched, and heart in the second couplet. Okay. जो रहे सो खबर चली समते से एक हवा के चमन सुरूर का जल गया चली समते से एक हवा के चमन सुरूर का जल गया मगर एक शाहे निहाल हम जिसे दिल कहे सुहरी नहीं मगर Okay, let's see if we can move on from here. There we go. That was a very well-timed drop. This is the more familiar rendering, but this time in qawwali style. And note the very clear articulation of the opening line. Listen to the news of love's bewilderment, and the very beautiful rendering of the second line. No you remains, no I remains, all that remains is unself-consciousness. I won't play all of this for the sake of time.
न जुनू रहा न परी रही खबरे तहय्युरे इश्क सुन न जुनू रहा न परी रही खबरे तहय्युरे इश्क सुन न जुनू रहा और ना परी रही न तो तू रहा न तो मैं रहा न तो तू रहा न तो मैं.
It's an extremely beautiful recording. Scott Kugel unpacks Siraj's whole ghazal in a very fine essay, but here I just want to stress this paragraph. The assertion that ghazal poetry should be understood in the Sufi context as allegory alone works only when the poem's read on the page, but poems are sung, given voice through melody and given pulse through rhythm, and when voiced as music, an allegorical interpretative strategy does not resolve the tension. Singing the poem allows all levels of the image to impact the listener at once, the secular and the spiritual, in real time, in the momentary beat of music that cannot be stalled or stopped. In their performance, ghazals musically exploits creative ambiguity in interpreting, through melodic and rhythmic techniques, metaphors that describe the beloved. Do such metaphors apply to all beautiful sensory perception, to beautifully alluring people, to a particular person, to the spiritual teacher, to the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, or to God? The answer is yes to each, and no to any one exclusively. When the ghazal is sung, in other words, all its layers and meanings, including visceral and sublinguistic ones, operate on listeners at once. Eisenhower's diffuse meanings. This one's a Persian ghazal, again by Khusro, that's both distinctly erotic and these days only ever sung by qawwals. There are layers of ambiguity here with the lyrics intertextual references to human beloveds, music and dance, and elements from the garden, and a skillful singer might tease those worldly meanings out. But it also describes the course of a spiritual listening assembly in which the devotee's loss of bodily control is due instead to entering into spiritual communion with the saints and prophets that have gone before. The painting by a mid-17th century Mughal master likewise depicts a Sufi assembly in which the attendant qawwals are, through their music, carefully assisting Sufi devotees to experience and then come down from various stages of ecstasy. I want to draw your attention to the last couplet. Somehow, in this ecstatic assembly, brought on through listening, both God and the Prophet were supernaturally present amongst those gathered in that place. The painting is even more explicit about the potential of the Sufi majlis-i samā to bring about the out-of-time gathering of the living devotees and the blessed dead in an especially potent threshold space. The tomb shrine of the founder of the Chishti order in South Asia, Khaja Moinuddin at Ajmer. The painting depicts a spiritual listening assembly at the shrine on the death anniversary, or urs, of Khaja Moinuddin, which is celebrated as a wedding, the moment of the annihilation of his earthly self in the spiritual flame of the divine beloved. This is the grave of Amir Khusro today at the shrine of his beloved master, Chishti saint Hazrat Nizamuddin in Delhi. Many pilgrims and lovers of poetry come to the shrine during Khusro's Urs to ask Chishti saints who've gone before to mediate for them as perfected human beings who've passed through the veil. Khusro's tomb is a particularly verdant imagined garden in stone, but also in the carpets of fresh flowers that are brought to cover his grave every day. Most important, though, during his Urs are the spiritual listening assemblies held in his memory, because he was the founder of Qawwali, in which the Qawwals sing Khusro's Qawwalis and bring today's listeners into the barzakh of ecstatic experience between material and spiritual worlds. You may have noticed an accretion of barzakhs in this particularly sanctified place. The grave of the saint, imagined as a garden, the saint himself, the majlis for spiritual listening, all of which act in concert to produce an especially powerful atmosphere of the confluence of mortal and eternal worlds. And right at the end of a performance on YouTube by Badr Miyandad of this very ghazal, when he sings the last couplet invoking God and the Prophet's supernatural presence in the majlis, the earthly master of the majlis goes into a deep ecstatic state. The ability of music to mess with our perception of time and to bring together in the one place, quite historically, all the saints and prophets that have gone before with the living devotees, is glanced upon by Khusro in another ghazal that specifically addresses the power of music. Blessings upon the musician who in a single moment can move another to weeping, to laughter, to wakefulness, to slumber. God's leave upon those persons who, when they sing, by their song is raised up the gathered multitude, and you will behold the people drunk. The theologian Shahab Ahmad noted that the first reference concerns the true musician whose music transports the listener to another state of being, tarab, defined by ethnomusicologist Jonathan Shannon as emotional states of bliss and rapture induced by specific stock musical phrases and temporal techniques, and that the second couplet is about the experience of transportation of tarab. It refers to the resurrection and gathering of everyone who has ever lived on the Day of Judgment, or Qiyamat, using a quote from the Quran, "You will behold the people drunk, but they will not be drunk." In other words, the music heard by the earthly gathering creates a Qiyamat of the imagination in which it's possible for devotees to commune with the saints. The majlis-i samā as an imagined Qiyamat is evoked directly in this painting. Saints that have gone before are gathered on both edges of the arena in which the living devotees are experiencing ecstasy. The separation between the living and the dead is maintained spatially, but all are present in the barzakh. At the top, Khaja Muinuddin and his disciples Qutbuddin, Nizamuddin, etc. And at the bottom, a series of Hindu saints, Raidas, Namdev, Kabir, Gorakh, and so forth. The Qawwal's music thus creates a time out of time in which the barzakh of the imagination creates possibilities for denizens of the quotidian world to commune with the world to come. Both Eisenlohr and Shannon note that this has to do with the way bodies encounter sound. Eisenlohr's atmospheres involve sonic modifications of felt space that are patterned and perceived as suggestions of movement, which are at the same time feelings. Eisenlohr's focus is on how sonic qualities of loudness, fundamental frequency, timbre, and reverb create atmospheres. Shannon, on the other hand, focuses on key things to creating tarab through music. One is a good feedback relationship between performers and audience, the mutual tuning in relationship, the experiential we established during music making. This relationship is incumbent on knowledgeable audiences expecting certain patterns to appear, and musicians eventually providing them, but also playing with expectations. Particularly important are the use of techniques of repetition and the manipulation of stock phrases. These strategies have the effect of altering the listener's experience of temporality. Melodic repetition creates a sense of suspended time, recalling those phrases that came before and anticipating those to come. This contributes to a sense of detemporalization as listeners hover between retentions of previously heard material and the expectations of material yet to come. What brings listeners back down from this suspension into a renewed sense of time and flow is the deployment of known closing phrases that retemporalize the listener. It's this that elicits the characteristic shouts, ahs, and bodily movements of listeners' reactions. The best way I can explain this shifting between suspended time and time in flow is simply to show you. And for the sake of time, I won't talk more about this, but it's a short performance from a performance of an Urdu ghazal by Khusro in a private musical assembly in Pakistan put on for aficionados. And it's not designed for devotional ecstasy, but for aesthetic listening. And the word nena, glance, eyes, acts throughout as a sonic anchor, pulling listeners back into temporal flow. Back. He's going to play with us now.
Sani pare sagabada pa, sani pare sagabada pa, gamada pa pa gamade. Sani
We'll cut it back.
Samā ga pa ma pa ga ma ga sani samā ga pa ma pa ga ma ga ni ma ta ma pa ga ma ga ta ni na de de.
And we're back. Isn't that marvelous? Okay, in conclusion, you'll be pleased to know. I want to turn away from the devotional ghazal, if I can get away from the devotional ghazal, to the Mughal courtly majlis and explore how poets cleverly turned Sufi concepts to explore the listener's sense of earthly mortality, of life in the face of death, in a way quite opposite to the Sufi majlis' celebration of death as a wedding. Over many years, I've become convinced that to the Mughals, the performance of music in the courtly majlis was about nothing less than life in the face of death, that it was most profoundly a meditation upon mortality, an exuberant, defiant raging against the dying of the light. The poignancy of life's transience lingers like a sweet, sad penumbra behind all Mughal descriptions of the joys of the majlis. Ghalib's couplets I quoted earlier, out of context, conceal a rather brutal punch. At night, we imagined that every corner of the carpet was so abundant with flowers that it might be the apron of a gardener or the fist of a flower seller. The gracefulness of the cupbearer's walk and the pleasure of the sound of the harp made this a heaven for the eye, that a paradise for the ear. But if you come into the gathering, come the break of dawn, see, there is no more joy or burning, hubbub or excitement. The wound of separation from that night's companionship burns. Only one candle remains, and it too is snuffed out. The fact that music dies and cannot be relived is the source, I believe, of its most profound pleasures. Today, in playing you recorded clips, I have been cheating, for I study sound worlds that I can never hear because they're gone, beyond recall, and I feel the pull of that eternal separation rather acutely. Perhaps that's why I recognize that same distinctive yearning in the writings of the courtly men I study, their luxuriation in the poignancy of music's ephemerality, their elevation of that into their primary aesthetic. This is what the 18th century Urdu poet Mir had to say. Last night, having opened that closed heart with the power of wine, we seated ourselves in the tavern. What fools were we? A voice came, remember the age that has passed away. For sure it was an admonishment, O sharp-witted company. Jamshed, who invented the wine glass, what happened to him? Where did those gatherings go? Where that music and drinking, except in the bowl of the tulip? There is no trace of his glass. The poppy now carries the wine flask in his place. Where young men once tossed back wine, the willows sway. The host's head, long turned to clay, now forms the brick that stops the wine cask. It is knowledge of the melody's sure and certain death, of its mortality, that makes its experience in the moment of its brief life so vital for listeners, sensing within it their own mortality. That the mortal condition was fundamentally what the courtly majlis was about is rather hard to get at, just through study of the musical materials themselves. Not one of the rags is associated with death, nor do the lyrics of the Mughal song forms that became today's classical genres, Chopard, Khayal, and Tomri, address death directly. There's a great deal on the frustrations of separation from a recalcitrant beloved, usually Krishna, or in a more Sufi mode, the moth singeing his wings in the beloved's candle flame. But the latter only speak of mortality when contemplated from the specifically theological standpoint in which life is separation and death brings union with the divine beloved. The sense of death I'm talking about is different, tinged with a very worldly sadness, not the transcendent hope of eternal bliss, death as eternal separation from things dearly loved. Take this iconic painting of a Mughal musical gathering. In painting and poetry on the theme of the majlis, it's noteworthy that the objects of intense sensory pleasures are all things that die. The sound of music and recited poetry, the scent of perfume and fresh flowers, the taste of wine and delicious food, the sight of natural and human beauty, and a touch of a youthful beloved, all enjoyed only for a moment, all destined to pass away. And it's in more courtly sung ghazals that we find songs that speak directly to this theme of death as separation. We can't finish without hearing part of one of these, written by modern Urdu poet Jigar and sung by one of the last great courtesans of North India, Begum Akhtar, both now gone. These days, I feel I am becoming a stranger to sorrow. The happiness in each part of me, though, diminishes bit by bit. What qiyamat, what day of judgment, O beauty of both worlds, this keeps happening, that the assembly is the same, but it satisfies the heart less and less. The same tavern and company, the same wine cup, the same glass, but the sweet sounds of conviviality grow dull and faint. The same beloved and cupbearer, but the heart grows cool. The same candle, but the light grows dim. It is the same light, the same life, Jigar. This is your condition, as though from living, life becomes smaller and smaller. The historical worlds of Khusro and Hafez, of Siraj, Mir and Ghalib, of Jigar and Begum Akhtar have all themselves long passed into silence. But their spirits are still, in some sense, present with us through their ghazals that commune with each other and with us, heedless of the centuries that lie between us, obliterating time and space in the barzakh of the imagination. Thank you. And you'll also be pleased to know that there is no respondent, and I'll answer Q&A over a drink.
I'm not a respondent, as Katherine has said. I just wanted to thank her for a beautiful, rich talk. I feel like we've heard about things we can know and things we can't know, and that you've captured that beautifully. That was rich and erudite, but also profoundly moving. So thank you, Katherine, for that. And I can't think of a better talk for encouraging us to enjoy our own conviviality, sociability, and porosity. So please, will you thank Katherine with me again for a wonderful inaugural lecture?